Well, as you can see, I brought quite a few books along, and especially with a smaller group, I'm going to encourage you, if you have questions, start, happy to stop. What I had thought to do tonight is sort of give an overview of classical education and what it is and the history of it, so that there's a better understanding of where we are today. And I think it's a pretty fascinating history, a fascinating story. History repeats itself, but certain things don't exactly repeat in quite the same way. And when it comes to education, it's an especially curious path that we've taken. So I've also brought, as you can see, some books. And the idea behind that was, some of you might be interested in one or the other books, and rather than my talking about it, say, which one was that? You can just take a picture of it, and you can go get that book. When I've given this talk in the past, there have always been parents that have messaged me later, or teachers, whoever was there, saying, oh, I read this book, and now I'm doing X, Y, and Z. So in one of the schools, for example, one of the teachers got so interested in classical education for special needs students because of Cheryl Swope's book that she's now specializing in that. So it started something. I'm not saying that you have to go and get all of these books, but the idea is to sort of give you an option of finding some things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by giving a little bit of my background, which might actually help explain some of what I'm going to talk about. Hello, how are you? It's good to see you here. I'm glad you joined the crowds. I mean, Jesus had 12 disciples. We can start small and you can go spread the good news, right? So, I never went to school, admission. So, my parents belonged to that small group of people that were looking around at schools in the 60s and saying, I don't think our kids are going to go into this, especially because we were living in New York City at the time. New York City was a fun place in the 60s, and so they said, all right, well, we're just going to not send them. Well, that was illegal in those days. So I spent my entire childhood never spending more than 3 months anywhere, because social services would knock on the door, and we'd go to the nearest airport and fly somewhere else. It was very simple. It was just, busy, busy traveling. And so inadvertently, I ended up with a classical education, which was completely unplanned. It just happened to be this way. My father was older when I was born, and so he still had a lot of what had been a classical education in England. He'd gone to college in England in the 20s and the 30s. So this was, a different era still. And so we grew up not with textbooks. You couldn't even get the textbooks. We grew up reading books. We traveled a great deal because of his work as well. He worked for NASA, and so and did a lot of other things in that field. So I was in Europe and all over the place, and we were on a ferry crossing a lake somewhere reading the dialogues, and that was sort of the background. That was my childhood. And I had no idea that this was a classical education. This was just very organic. It was happening, and because of my father's work, I grew up with a lab at home, which nobody ever said we couldn't touch. The only rule was, well, just don't kill yourself or someone else. That was it. Those are the only 2 rules. Make a fire, okay, it's your job to take it out. So we had a lot of options. My mother was the artist. She painted. She was the delicate rose of the family, who made beautiful artworks and clothing and so on. So, again, we had both sides of that. And I ended up going to college in England, not in the United States. And I went to a very old school. I managed to inadvertently, again, end up in a school where I was one of the first women allowed into this particular school, which resulted in the men of the college marching through town with black bands on their arms saying, "Education is dead." So that was welcome to school. All right. So that was fun. But it was still classical in many ways, and it still is today. It's held on to a lot of those traditions. They don't have regular tests. You could show up to lecture or not. It's up to you. Didn't matter. You could spend 2 years not going anywhere and pass if you could read all the books and write the test or write the book. Or you could attend every single one and still fail it because it wasn't good enough. So it was a very different experience for me. And I ended up studying the sciences. So I did natural sciences, then I ended up doing natural sciences and philosophy, and then I ended up doing theology. So I ended up with a lot of different paths. And it was through science that I actually started getting interested in education, because my cornerstone project or thesis was the effect of technology on developing brains. So we were doing gamma cell radiation, we were looking at all of this stuff, and so this is in the last century, quite literally, and we knew then that technology was going to have a profound effect on young children and on their brains and on their development, and I was incredibly frustrated that nobody seemed to bother about this. So, oh well, computers are great. It can't be that bad. I'm looking at this data saying, my child, when I have them, will never, ever be in front of this screen until they're X old. I'm just not doing that. So that really began a passion for teaching, combined with I happened to end up teaching in various different schools. So instead of going down the science route, I ended up teaching science and literature, etc. So that's sort of how I got into that world. And again, it was through the science world that I began to explore classical education more and more. I taught classically, naturally. To me, this seemed like the most common sense way of teaching. The first school I was at in England was very much a small, private, old-fashioned type of school. Classical, again, the term wasn't there. It wasn't termed classical, but it was. And it made complete sense from everything I'd studied on brain development. Well, then I come back to the United States. And oh boy, I'm walking into these schools and saying, what are they doing? What is this? These children are hating school. What's happening? I was very confused by the entire process. I found it incredibly depressing to see what they had to do and how little result there was at the end. But for me, the biggest question was, why are they segregating all these subjects? It made absolutely no sense to me. How could you possibly be studying science and not refer to theology at all? Or how could you talk about history and there's no art in it at all? It's just answer the questions, yes, no, multiple choice. Okay. And all these students are coming to me, I hate history. Oh, that hurt. That hurt. So it didn't take very long for me to say, all right, I'm out of here. I'm doing my own thing, and I've done my own thing since. My husband will tell you, well, I told you. She'll always do her own thing. So what I'm going to do is sort of go back and say, all right, how did we end up with the situation we have today? And why is classical coming back? Where did it come from? And if there's one book that I can recommend, it's Stratford Caldecott's Beauty for Truth's Sake. Beauty for Truth's Sake. It is a beautiful, wonderful book. And he starts out essentially by asking that same question that I asked. How can you have a disconnect between science and faith? How can you have a disconnect between faith and reason? And he really helps us understand the essential questions. So, classical education, going back, we need to look at ancient Greece and Rome, of course. And if you look back at the ancient Greeks, we're going to talk about a chap named Plato. And Plato had this concept of 4 levels of knowledge. You had the imagination, which is sort of perceptions, the way we see things, illusions. Then there's belief, all right? So we recognize physical objects, we can see what's there, but we're limited to opinion. So it's limited to what we can see and opinion. And I'll preface that by saying, in many ways, that's where education has stopped today, is what's your opinion? All right, here's the information, and now we move on. Okay, never got to the next steps. But in his view, well, you're just getting started. The third is logical and mathematical reasoning. So you're still relying on assumptions. And then the fourth one is understanding. When you've gotten to the level of understanding, you've gone beyond just what I can see and what I can touch. Our senses can be wrong. We can look at something and say, oh, that's cold, and the next person touches it. No, it's not, it's hot. Well, it depends on your body temperature, right? So our senses can deceive us. So, if you're looking at the ancients, their thought is, well, how do we get to what the true answer is? How do we get there? And when you've reached that level, from when you've left just opinion behind and you've gotten to the highest intellectual and philosophical truth, that's when you've really reached what God wants us to get to. And so essentially, classical education was this concept of going through the different stages to understand truth, real truth, and truth, the understanding of how everything works. So the education focused on the trivium and the quadrivium. So trivium is the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The ancients looked at these concepts and they pretty much said, all right, we're going to do all of these because the ultimate goal is virtue. The ultimate goal is dialectic reasoning, virtue, truth. So they're doing their thing. And of course, the system that they have is discussion. You have the forum. You don't have tests. You don't have quizzes. I love the dialogues where the students are drawn into an understanding. They're not told, they're not informed. You explore and you go deeper and deeper until you've reached that truth, which is it's a beautiful thing. The Romans take this on, of course. They take over the Greeks. They bring the Greek scholars back to Rome. And the Roman education refines the Greek methods, takes it over. Of course, you have to have Virgil, who's going to, write a Homeric epic, of course, has to be better than anything. But the Romans, especially towards the end of the Roman Empire, managed to take this beautiful system and kind of do with it what we've done with education today and turned it into this rote learning and memorization, and kids hated it. All of a sudden, there was this hatred of learning. This is ridiculous. We don't need it. Why are we doing it? We're going to reject it. It's quite funny when you read some of these accounts, and you say, well, that sounds remarkably like what we have today. So again, they managed to take a great thing and through rote stuff sort of destroy a lot of this. So we go through the so-called Dark Ages. They weren't. They really weren't. But a lot of people understand what I mean when I say the Dark Ages. But we get into the medieval scholasticism. And this book, The Liberal Arts Tradition, has a wonderful introductory section on that medieval scholasticism. But again, I'm also going to say this book has the best summary of all. During the medieval times, you have classical education preserved through monasteries and through cathedral schools. You have the monks who've copied painstakingly all of this great information on mathematics and truth and philosophy, and they preserve it and they save it. From this tradition, of course, we developed the universities, the great universities of Europe, in London and in Paris and in Italy, these centers of learning. And it's still the Greek concept of we have to unify this into the truth that ultimately God is truth. If the stuff that we're learning doesn't lead to God, then we're doing something wrong. And it's all highly integrated. So you have sort of this resurgence of the ancient Greek classical methods and studying these things. And of course, you have Thomas Aquinas and the great Catholic thinkers who take these concepts and Christianize it is one way of putting it, but take those truths and put it into the terms of our faith. And it's brilliant reading. It's wonderful reading. But they merge these philosophies. The university has followed these classical models. And it doesn't take very long when they're saying, gosh, we keep finding new things and there's more stuff. How are you going to learn all of it? I mean, you have 4 subjects, that's great, but we're learning more and more. How are you going to learn it? And even by the 13th century, there's already the question of, how do we teach everything? How do we do that? How long can we, how long does it take to learn everything? So 13th century, 14th century, there's already the question, should we maybe have a separate subject here? Perhaps somebody could just study the mathematics, maybe? But there were many voices that said, that's impossible. You can't study mathematics and not have music. So the debate was already happening back then. All right, how do we do this? How do we incorporate all of this? We go into the Renaissance and the early modern revival. Okay, so the classics from the monasteries spark the whole humanism, all of the concepts that come out, which start, I've always had this theory that Western civilization actually peaked in 1750. Ready for debate? Okay, and I have my reasons why. And it's because during this time period, there's still the concept that the ultimate truth is God. There's still the concept we learn because we want to know God. And after 1750, which is coincidentally the year Johann Sebastian Bach died, we start moving into, I'm doing it not for God, but for myself. The Descartesian view, I think, therefore I am, not I'm going to do this soli deo gloria for God. There's that change that takes place. But anyway, okay, so we get into the humanists. So education becomes more accessible. You have more schools. You have cathedral schools, but you also have local schools. So you have Erasmus and you have John Milton, and they're really pushing the rhetoric and the logic and the moral philosophy. Everything seems to be going along just fine. There aren't that many massive changes. You do occasionally have a couple of systems where more colleges are starting and a couple of them branch off into a specific field. But we then have Napoleon. Napoleon marches through Europe and with his armies, manages to get himself caught in Russia, of course. And the Prussians say, this isn't going to happen to us again. We're going to make sure that we never get beaten. We're going to have the best army, the best people. So we're going to start a school system, the Prussian model, and we're going to train the best soldiers and the best thinkers and the best engineers and the best chemists and the best of everything. So how are we going to do this? All right. Well, we're going to come up with this phenomenal system. We're going to have everyone sit in rows. They can't ask any questions. We're going to tell them what they need to know, and then we're going to test them, and after 1 hour, a bell will ring, and they will all get up and go to the next room and study something else. And we will make soldiers, and we will make men that know how to listen immediately, and they know how to answer the questions immediately. None of this philosophy, we don't need that. We just need men who can shoot straight, answer the directions, and follow orders. Sound good? All right, okay. Ain't nobody taking us down again. Put this little spike on. All right, we're ready. Okay, Prussian model. Prussian model, well, all the schools, districts, and countries are looking at this saying, well, this sounds actually rather easy to implement, especially because you can take any teacher and say, all right, here's a book, here you go. Here's the list of stuff they need to know. Here's the quiz. You don't necessarily have to know the stuff, just make sure they know it and can spit it back. Good? Yes? All right, phenomenal. All right, so now you start having people going to teachers' colleges who are not really interested in the philosophy or anything else, but they need a job. And maybe they weren't strong enough to be soldiers. Maybe they weren't smart enough to go into the best colleges, but they could be teachers. And that's okay. That's fine. So we have Rousseau, Social Contract. Who knows this wonderful book? Yes, Rousseau. I have my kids read Rousseau, and every now and then they read this and they say, he said what? I love it. It's great. But you have these new ideas coming in, and these new concepts and thoughts of, on the one hand, we're going to have this Prussian model, you're going to simply listen and obey, but also I want to do my own thing. I want to listen to somebody else. Who's this God person to tell me what to think? I want to, have a wife, not have a wife, raise my kids, not raise my kids, should be on me, right? Why should I follow any kind of model or system or whatever? I don't like any of that. So under Bismarck in particular, we have compulsory schooling now. Kids are required to attend to school. I mean, that's okay. That's all right. But with that compulsory education came standardized curriculum. And that standardized curriculum emphasizes reading, writing, math, history, and obedience to authority. So if you read the original documents of these school systems in Prussia, which are fascinating to read, beautifully typed up little documents, the obedience to authority is the first thing. Not the reading or the writing or the math. It's the obedience to authority. And they have all kinds of quizzes and tests and methods to make sure that these people could answer immediately and respond in the right way. It's terrifying, but it's interesting reading. With that, you then have the teacher training colleges to make sure that instruction is uniform. I mean, how could we possibly have Saxony have a completely different curriculum than Bavaria? I mean, intolerable. I mean, you got to put the two together. They have to know the same things, be able to listen to the same orders, etc. And with that comes a tracking system. Tracking system divides students based on academic ability. So, and Germany still has this system today. France, not as much. Germany is still completely in place. So in Germany, you had those that were destined for higher education, tracked from the age of 9, 10, 11. Today in Germany is usually 9 or 10. That's the gymnasium level, those that can go to college. The next ones are trained for labor or military service. So you didn't really have options. It was college, military, or the bottom. In Germany today, you have Gymnasium, Hauptschule, and Realschule. Nothing's changed. It's very difficult. You can go between the two. You can drop out of one lower. You can move up. It's not easy. Some people do, but generally speaking, the tracking system has remained the same. And especially in the lower levels, there's no art, there's no music, there's very little history. It really focuses on what they call the servile arts, the practical skills, some reading and some writing, some basic math. They don't really need much else. Why should we waste state resources? It's about money now. They're kids. There's money. We should spend it on the smart ones. All right, okay. With that discipline and obedience comes loyalty to the state, respect for hierarchy, and fitting in this new society. So loyalty to the state is now something that's actively part of the curriculum versus an inherent love, a desire for virtue, we want truth, we want these things. No, it's something else at this point. So in the United States, you have a chap named Horace Mann. Horace Mann goes over to Prussia. He looks around and says, this is a great idea. We've got this huge country in the United States. It's growing. Manifest destiny is full swing. We're taking over whatever land we can. We need to have some kind of system where we're unified and, it doesn't matter if you're in Wisconsin or New York, you have an approximate idea that's going to be the same, and I checked those military academies in Prussia. It's pretty impressive. We need to build that. Our army's, not that great right now. Let's just build this up. So Horace Mann brings us in. He studies the model, and by the early parts of the 20th century, you had a compulsory education model throughout all the United States. The standardized testing, the teacher certification, everything came with that. So, all right, so we have a system. In some ways, there are arguments that the systems that were in place were great for all of the immigrants coming in. The argument was you get kids coming from Italy, from Prussia, from Czechoslovakia, from France, from wherever. They go to school and they come out speaking English, and they come out American citizens, and they know the rules. So this is great. So, there are many that argue that that's a positive. Okay, that's fine. But at this time, we have a new guy, John Dewey. Dewey is a bad word in classical education. It's the D word. It's Dewey. It's John Dewey. Huge figure in shaping American education, but also, shapes education around the world. Dewey comes along, and he promotes progressive education. All right, experiential learning, that's the way to go. Critical thinking, social engagement, these are buzzwords. Rote memorization, poetry, music, we don't need that. We don't need any of that. Education should prepare students for democratic participation, real-world problem solving, rather than focusing on mastering any particular body of knowledge. And so we should have this child-centered experiential learning, and we need to go away from novels and philosophy and all of these sorts of thoughts. And if you think back on Plato's original concepts, again, you have immediate experience and you have opinion. Under Dewey's model, you never get to the last two steps. There's no option for that. You're only going to have child experiences something. What do you think? Great. Answer the quiz. Move on. There's no need to memorize anything. There's no need to go deeper. None of this is really important. It's only important for the end goal. The end goal is the only thing that matters. So if you're going to do music, it's because there's an ultimate purpose. For instance, for a while, this data came out, oh, you know what? Some of the best doctors have an undergrad in music. Oh, well, then we should do music so we get better doctors. Well, that's one way of thinking about it. Okay, so, all right. So Dewey's influence for the progressive education basically becomes the American model in the United States. Very strong in the 20s and 30s, continues beyond his lifetime, and really fundamentally shaped the education world globally, really. Classical educators say Dewey killed education. That's what we say. You no longer have a deep engagement with history. Matter of fact, history doesn't really exist as a subject anymore. It becomes social studies. It's not history anymore. Social studies is the emotion, the feelings, how did people react to versus, let's look at the primary sources. Let's look at what actually happened and then discuss what should have happened, what would have been the right answer. Focusing more on the emotion. Okay. No wonder people hate history because, those emotions can change drastically. Truth and virtue are central to a classical education, and those words don't exist in Dewey. Dewey's concept is, his pragmatism is more relativistic. We have to be adaptable. There is no objective truth. Well, he could have a truth, and he could have a truth, and, well, I don't know. I don't want to offend either of them. We're going to go in the middle somewhere. So you never really end up even discussing what that truth could be. You might offend somebody, and those concepts could change. I mean, he might change his mind next week, and then we have to follow that. So, the relativistic concept comes in. Dewey specifically wanted to de-emphasize classical languages, so, and that's not just Latin and Greek, but really language as a whole. You should only really study a foreign language if there's a practical need or a purpose for it. So literature and philosophy, those need to go. There's no point in somebody who's going to go into the trades or who's becoming a doctor in reading Pride and Prejudice. They don't need it. It's a waste of time. If you're going to become a doctor, you should be reading your anatomy and physiology manual, right? You should be reading your Merck's manual. That's what you should be doing. Who needs Pride and Prejudice? I mean, really. So, we replace these with skill-based curricula. Classical education sees teachers as people who are immersed in truth and in virtue, whose purpose is to guide their students to truth, to virtue, to God. In Dewey, we now have facilitators. We have the guide on the side. You know what I mean. The facilitator. No direct instruction, well, we'll support you. And education really becomes a social engineering thing. Education is a tool for social reform. The politicization of schools really became a thing under Dewey, because now, depending on who runs the curriculum, depending on what you put in that curriculum, depending on what the state decides you should have in there, now we're going to push that. Now we're going to promote that. instead of promoting what is goodness and what is truth and what is beauty, it's, well, which of these people should we elect? And which group is going to support us more, etc. You know, do children really need to be involved in that? All right, we can talk about that. All right, so in many ways, that skill-based approach and relativistic approach becomes the norm. It becomes the standard. There's a handful of people that are saying that there's something wrong with this. This isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. Charlotte Mason was one of the first to speak out about this. Charlotte Mason was an English educator who starts really a parent group to say, you know, in 100 years from now, our children aren't going to be able to read. They're not going to be able to engage. They're not going to be able to maintain memory. You know, right now, and she's complaining, in the late 1800s, children just can't memorize the way they used to. They're not reading the way they used to. And I look at their reading list and think, if kids today could read half of this, we'd be thrilled. And she's ringing a panic button saying, oh, there's something wrong. So she's a visionary, very much a visionary. What she does, in many ways, lays the foundation for the modern classical world, because she understood that we're not in the ancient Greek times. We have more than 4 subjects. Students need to be able to become engineers or, you know, go into some very practical field, and not everyone's going to go to university. So how do we go about this teaching of the good and the true and the beautiful on a very practical level? So she really focuses on the concept of how to integrate and combine all the different subjects in such a way that children can explore them in young ages. So young children should go on nature walks. They should go outside and actually look at the trees instead of just talking about the trees. Experience it, because her key word is wonder. We've lost wonder. If you think we've lost wonder now, and she's saying this in the late 1800s, I sure would like to know what it was like before. I would have loved to have been there to see what, you know, she saw was missing. Because she goes back in scriptures, she goes back into history, and she goes back and she says, if you look at every time, you know, God reached out to us, there's a sense of wonder. This is beautiful. It was good. It was incredible. Not, where's the quiz? You know? And so I love her writing. I love the way she essentially says you will start teaching virtue by helping children experience the good and the true, awakening that sense of wonder, and then leading them into that deeper thought. So in a way, she lays that foundation of how do we bring back the classical. Of course, this is incredibly radical. How could we possibly, you know, actually implement all of these different things? So not many people are really following this. There's a handful of people. You've got, you know, they're not hippies. They're the oddballs on the side that say, this is a great idea. We need to have these concepts. We need to have these materials. There are small groups in England, a handful of groups in the United States, but it's really not a thing. Until 1947, Dorothy Sayers in Oxford writes or gives a speech, The Lost Tools of Learning. So it's published. She gave it in 1947. It's published in 1948. So World War II has just ended. The 2 wars are utterly destructive. They've changed the world really forever. And you know, I've put it here. Anyway, you can find it online. It's free to get. And she says, I don't really know very much about teaching, but I can tell you we're in trouble. People can't read, they can't write, they can't think. You know, I don't think that anything I'm saying is ever going to be heard. Quite literally, page 2, she says, the reforms that I'm proposing will never be carried into effect. She's already sort of, I know this is hopeless. Neither the parents, nor the training colleges, nor the examination boards, nor the boards of governors, nor the Ministry of Education would countenance them for a moment. But she says if we want to maintain our freedom, we've just gone through World War II, we've just experienced the Blitz, we've seen what happens with fascism, we've seen the dictatorship. In her view, if we don't bring back truth, if we don't start teaching our children what virtue is and how to think, what's to stop us from going right back into that? We need to bring in a change. So there are other topics that are in there, but if you want to get started on something really short and simple, I do recommend reading this. I think it's flawed in many ways because it really sticks with the trivium and doesn't go in the quadrivium, but that's okay, that's all right. But she's ringing an alarm bell. But she's right in the sense that it's all right after World War II. We've got the boom, we're building cars, we're trying to rebuild, education, well, we'll get there. We've got to rebuild first. But it doesn't take very long when you start getting all kinds of little more and more warning bells are coming. I have probably 24 books of this type at home. The global achievement gap, the end of education. I have almost 12 books just on why can't kids read, dating back to even as early as the 60s. There are people saying, well, what's happened? They can't read, they can't think, they can't, we're not getting the same standards. So there's a problem here. What do we do? Disorientation, how to go to college without losing your mind. Great book. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend anyone who's got kids heading out to college, this is a great option. But you do have more and more people starting to say, okay, there's something wrong. Well, great. In 1957, so that's 10 years after Dorothy Sayers, Sputnik happens. Sputnik is launched. All right, massive panic in the United States. Russia's going to make it there before us. We've got to do something. Global disaster. How could we not be the first man out there? All right, okay. So Sputnik is launched, and the United States basically says we need to push science, we need to push mathematics, technology, and engineering, the STEM, and we don't have a Department of Education. None of that exists. So how are we going to push that? A lot of people don't realize this entire push came through the National Defense Education Act. It came through the Defense Department. It came through the Army, all right? So United States is falling behind on the space race. Congress passes the NDEA Act in 1958. It's just a year later. And this pours funding into schools for sciences, for mathematics, foreign language, especially Russian. You're going to learn Russian, we're going to put you right in the top. Provides funding for students to go into these critical fields. You remember those days that grandparents might have talked about? Yeah, I went to college for about $400 a year. Well, that's over now, because colleges can now say, yeah, it's $400, but if the state's paying for it, oh, we'll just add a zero. They don't care. Numbers will start going up. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. My husband went to a very good school, and I tell students, I'm a guidance counselor, and I'll tell them, that school was $8,000 a year when my husband went, and that was considered massively expensive. That school is now $79,000 a year, just the tuition alone. It's just, well, okay. All right, so we get research universities, we have math teacher training, and so you now have these massive reforms that take place with academic standards. Testing becomes the number one. We can't fall behind. We have to be the number one in math. How do we know that? We're going to test them. I'm going to keep testing them. I'm going to keep testing them. And it's funny that with all the testing, somehow or other, the math didn't improve. Funny how that happened. It just didn't. So we have to test some more, of course. And we have to pour more money into books. Now you have publishers coming out with, well, we need an updated book. And millions upon millions are being poured into textbooks. And that affects Catholic schools too, because Catholic schools, so up till this time, have sort of kind of held the line on the liberal arts. But, it's getting a little tight. The religious orders are dwindling. You now start having to pay teachers. How are we going to get the money? And the local city comes in, we get all these books. You want to have the books? You can get these books for nothing. We already bought 10,000 of them. you could get these books for nothing. We'll give them to you. All of a sudden, these parochial schools are using the same books that are in the public schools, and with the same agendas and the same concepts, right at the time that the United States as a whole is going through a whole social shift and religion is really, really out. Religious orders are dwindling, churches are starting to empty out. It was a mess. It was a real mess. It was a real mess. So it was a bit of a crisis time. The other thing that was happening at this time, and I'm kind of passionate about this one, is with that STEM, the Defense Association said, you know what, we can accelerate this. We can get our engineers faster. And we're going to do this by introducing something called the AP exam. AP exam, kids can pass it in high school, they get their credits, and they can get to college faster, they'll get done faster. Maybe we can produce an engineer in 3 years instead of 4. So now higher education is not an accumulation of truth, a body of wisdom that you're achieving. There's no virtue in it. It's points. You're just collecting points. You got enough points? Well, here's your diploma. I think everybody in the Middle Ages was rolling in their graves. I mean, you could practically feel the European cemetery shake when that thing came through. So what's happened to education? So, and I mean, there are students today that, I have many students in high school that will do dual enrollment, and I will emphasize it. And some of them are very bright, and they can do them. Franciscan has wonderful dual enrollment options. Don't do it just to get ahead. Don't do it to get the points. Do it because you're passionate about the subject, because you can, because you love it. Do it for a greater reason than I just want to get done early. Sometimes they look at me funny. I think most of them get it. I think most of them get it. Most of them do. So, all right. So you have the AP, ROTC, all of these things come in. So we're now in sort of the mid-20th century, and the bells are getting louder and louder about this isn't working, Why Johnny Can't Read comes out, and you start having more and more books come out, like How to Read a Book, the Classical Guide to Intelligent Reading. How to read a book. It's funny that we have to actually have a book on how to read a book. But this book becomes, practically overnight. It's like, wow, this is amazing. There's some very interesting information in here, such as how to read a book means you open it, you look inside, and you'll see that there's, an index. There's this thing called a margin in here, and you can make notes in it. It's really great. You should try it someday, right? There's things like discovering the author's intentions. Right? What's he mean here? How to agree or disagree with an author. So, how would you figure out what he's saying, number one? And now you can have an opinion on it. I read a response to this book where a teacher in the college where this was being presented said, well, what if the student's opinion is wrong? Wait, what do you mean, what if the student's opinion is wrong? It's their opinion, and it's opinion on a book. So are we supposed to correct that now? Check, yes, no? And it was, to me, I saved this, this dialogue because it was such a synopsis of where we were at that point in time. But you have these people in the background, these radicals, homeschoolers, who say, you know what, we're going to take these old books, we're going to take the lost tools, and we're going to start reprinting older books on our own dime, cottage industry. We're going to start publishing them, and we're going to start coming up with our own concepts. They don't have curriculum per se. I homeschooled my children through high school, except for one of them, who went to a school, was necessary for him and for me. And so I'm very, very familiar with the homeschooling world. And one of my greatest objections to the homeschooling world was when they started bringing in these set curriculums. Like, why are you doing this for? That's exactly why we did this, to get away from it, and now you're producing another sort of gotta fill in the blanks thing, and you've got homeschooling parents driving themselves insane trying to follow all these lists. Just throw it out. And they look at me and say, but how do I know what to do? You can think for yourself. It's possible. It's possible. I've spent decades now meeting with terrified parents saying, I promise, if your children learn how to read great books, you won't need the how-to manual. You've taught them how to think. So you have people like Laura Berquist, who wrote, Designing Your Own Classical Curriculum. When this book came out, it was designed for homeschoolers. She sold out so quickly. She said, well, I didn't know this was popular. It wasn't because homeschoolers were buying it. It's because schools were buying it. Schools were looking at this, well, how do we do this? This looks really interesting. Wait, tentative schedule for 7th grade includes math and English and science and geography and religion and history and Latin. How are we supposed to fit all of this in one day? All of these days of the week. How is this supposed to happen? And she lays it out very carefully for each grade, how to integrate it, how they all fit together, how much you can teach by joining these different subjects together. Oh, well, okay. This is very interesting. At the same time, you have, and this is a book, I love this book. Does anyone know Dawson? Yes, great book, The Crisis of Western Education. So he really spoke out so eloquently and so brilliantly. Matter of fact, I used this last Friday at the PD. And he talks about how, essentially in the domain of public education, the principle of separation of church and state has been interpreted so incredibly rigorously that any kind of religion or any kind of virtue in education is considered, and I quote, unessential, non-vital, exceptional, and perhaps even unsocial. It's a brilliant book. I cannot say enough about this book because the analysis he has is incredible. Dawson converted to the Catholic faith, and his insights are absolutely incredible. Very readable book. So you have these voices, you have materials coming out, you have Dawson and the like saying, you know, we're essentially going to destroy our ability to think. Dawson in particular, if we take virtue out, we take religion out, ultimately this system we have in America, our system of democracy, is going to fail because democracy will only work with people who can think and who can reason and people of virtue. You take that out, it's not going to be very long. This experiment will have failed and we're just going to roll right back into dictatorships. So, you know, with people like this sounding the alarm, you have more and more people saying, oh, well, what do we do? What do we do? Where do we go? So as the homeschooling groups start to grow and you know, classical education grows, you have CERTSI Institute, Memoria Press, Classical Academic Press, they're growing and they're growing. The Great Books movement starts, Hillsdale College starts. You know, this explosion suddenly, but it's still sort of very much underground. New York State, I think, was the last state to finally legalize homeschooling in 1988. They were the last ones. I think Wisconsin was the first in 72. So, but it's still very much, you know, those weirdos that homeschool. You've got a tiny handful of Catholic schools that are sort of on board, but it's very difficult because most of the parishes don't really like this concept of something new, rocking the boat. We've already lost so many people. People are hemorrhaging from the church. Bringing something new in could mess things up. You know, so there's a lot of hesitation about this. So between the Protestant and the Catholic homeschoolers, you have Veritas Press, you have the Great Books programs, you have Thomistic groups that form, you have Seton Home Study that integrates Latin and logic and Catholic texts, you have Mother of Divine Grace, you have Angelicum Academy. In the Protestant groups, you have A. Becca for the Baptists, you have Bob Jones, you have Veritas Press, you have all of these different groups that are forming. And so, you know, it just becomes mainstream. At some point, I remember going someplace with my children, they said they were homeschooled, and somebody didn't say, what? Like, oh, all right, it's in, it's accepted, it's fine. So, we're sort of bubbling along. you've got all of a sudden a few radical standouts. You've got St. Jerome's in DC that says, all right, we're done. The school's going to close. We've got to do something radical, and we're going to throw all of this stuff out. And we're going to take this, and this out of the homeschool program, and we're going to start a classical school. Next thing you know, they're bursting at the seams. Whoa, that's working. Somebody started something. We then get COVID. The United States gets a sudden insight into schools, and there's a hemorrhaging exit. Wait, this is what my kids are learning? What are they doing? This is how they talk to them? Or, my child is depressed, my child can't stand in front, being in front of the screen. You get pods forming. I read in the Wall Street Journal last week that the dissatisfaction level with public schools is now 79%, highest it's been in forever. So, all of a sudden people are leaving this entire system, and schools are scrambling to figure out what this classical method is. My husband teaches in a public school, and we've been chuckling at how many times these new PDs are coming in. How to teach Socratic seminar. Yes, yes. And I was like, right, okay. The problem is, though, it's really funny. It's really hilarious. I have so many wonderful friends that teach in public schools that say, yeah, it comes along, but the problem is you can't really implement it. How can you have a Socratic seminar if you're not allowed to talk about God, and you're not allowed to talk about virtue, and you're not allowed to say, well, that's true, and I'm sorry, but that isn't. It's not really practical. You're still wallowing in the personal opinion level and not going into any of the higher virtue levels. So I'm just not quite sure if it's possible. Dawson didn't think it was possible to actually have this in a public school. So we'll see. We'll see where this goes. We'll see where this goes. Catholic schools start, going into this world of classical education. What's fascinating is that at the same time, you have scientists and of different kinds. Stanislas is a brilliant neuroscientist, and he has studied brains forever. We went to school together, and he continued on the science track, and I went on the education track. But we've stayed in touch ever since, because we both started on this, what do brains do? I studied, effective brains with the technology, and he went all the way. Like, he was one of the, the really smart people. So How We Learn and Reading in the Brain are incredible books on how children's brains develop, how they learn how to read. And it was really funny. What was coming out of this is that universally, the scientists, as they were studying child development, brain development, was saying, the model that really works for children, young children, is exploration. Teaching them about virtue and not having gray areas. It's actually rather important for child development. They develop this thing called extreme anxiety if they're not told that there is an absolute truth. It's really funny that science is now saying it, so now what do we do? Now we're stuck, okay? When it comes to reading in the brain, he describes that if you teach a child how to read and you never engage with it or never bring in that sense of wonder, it remains just words. It remains just letters. That depth of understanding will actually never come. Yeah.
I read an article as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, please do.
I read an article as well when you were talking about what makes true self-esteem.
Yes.
It goes back to that gray area.
Yep.
The child needs to know where the line is.
Yeah, they do.
So this way, if they cross it, they can expect certain behavior. If they don't, or reaction. And if they do, they don't, they can get the other reaction.
Yep.
But they get in trouble with the gray.
They get in trouble with that gray.
Yep.
They get in huge trouble. You get anxiety, you get depression, you get... the brain literally, on a neurological level, it starts looking at it as, maybe I shouldn't touch that because I don't know where to go with it. And it will literally not even continue developing. So that depth of thought that we're looking for in children actually can't even develop because we've not allowed them to get there. So Dorothy Sayers didn't know anything about this. She would have died before any of this came out. And in her Lost Tools of Learning, she describes that we just pour words at kids and we never teach them how to respond. And essentially, she understood this just by observation. And she essentially saw what the scientists would then establish as, through science. So, and it's so true. You know, we throw words at the kids, we give them information, we never teach them to engage with it and really wrestle with it. And they can do this at the youngest ages. Our second grade teacher was interviewed a couple of weeks ago, and she's talking about how these second graders, I mean, the youngest little kids, are really diving into the truth of a Bible story or whatever. They can really think if you give them that opportunity, if you allow them that chance. We have made the shift to classical, and over the years, what we're seeing every year, the senior year, is improving. Every year, they're getting a little better and a little better, and you see the types of questions they're able to ask, and you realize that that other group, they literally didn't even know how to. They had the classical education, but they got it so late. They struggled with how do I get into that depth? How do I go deeper? So this year we have a senior who got so fascinated by this entire concept that in 9th grade he came to me and he says, Mrs. Smith, I've realized I haven't read enough. Can you give me a list of books? I provided him a list of books and he started reading. He started reading some more. Last summer he went to a summer program at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, and he's reading through this material, and I met with him before he went. We're reading through, you know, documents and, you know, the fathers, and we're reading through really dense pieces, and we're churning through them. He said, you know, I couldn't have done this 3 years ago. I didn't know it was possible to do this. I keep telling him, just do it, and you'll get there. It'll happen. It'll happen. So, you know, where we are right now is that we really have moved through this wash area of nothing's working, kids can't read, end of education, and you're starting to see books like this one. Let Beauty Speak, The Art of Being Human in a Culture of Noise. This isn't even classical education, because people are realizing there's something missing. And in a world that's now coming out with AI robots for loneliness, I think people are realizing, oh my gosh, this is terrifying. An AI thing, don't want it. Stacey Trasancos is incredible. She is a chemist who worked at a very high level, and she had a conversion moment, and she realized none of this makes any sense without faith. The more she looks into it, she ends up writing Science Was Born of Christianity. She says, why did the sciences develop here and not in China? China had gunpowder before we did. Egypt had geometry before we did. The Middle East had algebra before we did. So why didn't they develop this? What happened? And it's a fascinating insight. So you're getting all of these books coming out, but at the same time, you have people saying, okay, well, that's all well and good. What if I have a kid with special needs? I have a Down syndrome child. I have a child with autism. I have a child with dyslexia. Well, that's great to say they're going to learn Latin. What's there for my child? So Simply Classical is a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. Cheryl is a brilliant woman who has special needs children. I'm sorry? Yep, she does. This book, I wish I'd had it when my children were little, because I have a special needs child, and I was figuring it out, what to do. And so we connect really well. She's a lovely, lovely lady. Classical education is ideal for special needs children. Special needs children don't have to be reading Plato, but they can absolutely be immersed in the good and the true and the beautiful. They actually learn so much better and so much more, and I've seen this now play out over the decades. When you take a special needs child and you have beautiful music playing, and you give them a beautiful painting, and you allow them to dive into beautiful stories, you give them the time to develop and think through it, they sometimes have the most profound thoughts, and they will blow you away. I have a student this year who has a lot of disabilities. She can sometimes, in the middle of a Socratic seminar where the kids are going back and forth with ideas, just suddenly say a single line, and everyone says, yeah, you're right. She just saw through it. But she was given the chance and the time to think through it, process it, they can get there. And it's beautiful to see that happen. Well, what about the kid who's not going to go to college? What about the kid who wants to go into the trades? I mean, he's going to use a hammer, or he's going to go into welding. Does he need Plato? The Common Arts Education by Chris Hall is another brilliant book. His argument, as is mine, is, do you want to have a plumber who knows what beautiful looks like? Or do you want a plumber who just knows how to make it happen? I'd much rather have the plumber who makes it look beautiful. Now let's add a plumber who knows how to make it beautiful and has learned about virtue. An honest plumber, he's never going to be lacking for work. An honest plumber who makes it look good, all right. Because it's not, in the end, what you will do. That's not our purpose. We're not created to be a plumber, a carpenter, an engineer, a scientist. We're created to be with God. We're created to know and to love Him. So if our education is only this pragmatic, practical, learn how to be a plumber, learn how to be an engineer, learn how to be a scientist, we've kind of missed the entire point. And I think we see that today. We see so many young people who say, I don't think university is worth it. I don't think studying has any point. Why do I need to be in school? When can I drop out? How fast can I leave? Read? Nobody's reading anymore. 30-second TikTok video will do it, but I'm still depressed. I don't know why. I'll watch another one. Yep.
You just heard that a student at Harvard actually wrote an article in the university newsletter, I guess it is,
Yeah.
chastising her classmates and fellow students because they didn't have the perseverance or the ability to read an entire book.
Yep.
Then she wrote a letter and chastised all the professors for dumbing down the
Yes.
curriculum to meet the needs of the kids because they're not asked to read a book. They're not asked. And when asked how many of the students actually read a book or a novel in high school, hardly any of them had done so.
Hardly any. Hardly any. That ability to persevere and get through a book, which would have been, a given in the past, is now a challenge. I actually read a fascinating article about an education program in a jail. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, on that topic, you mentioned studying technology's effects on children's development. What would be your practical recommendations for how kids should interact with technology, say, in the home?
Yeah. I mean, on my personal view, and this is just mine, I think that young children should have the absolute bare minimum, as little exposure to technology as possible. Their brains are developing, their ability to concentrate and focus is developing, and when children have the freedom to just play and use their imagination and build with blocks or use paints or do something in the lab, but you're not allowed to kill each other, that is where that real sense of wonder develops. Technology has a way of essentially taking that ability away. It takes away the ability to imagine what a character looks like in stories. It takes away the ability to create or even sing. I mean, technology gives us music on the push of a button. We just play it. Children can't sing anymore. Singing is something that is so inherent to us and it's so important. The part of the brain that's connected with singing is connected with memory, is connected with math. And it's so funny, when kids learn how to sing, especially at young ages, how much they can do. It just opens up a whole world. For me, it's also, when you can sing, oh my goodness, it makes such a difference in prayer. To be able to sing a hymn, to be able to sing, the Gloria, it just makes such a difference. We're taking so much away from our children just by not giving them those opportunities. Do they have to learn how to use technology? Yes, they can eventually. But technology, reality is most kids don't actually know how to use it. They know how to swipe through stuff. They don't actually know how it works. And I encounter this all the time. They can swipe through whatever and they get to something. And then I say, can you share the Google Doc with me? What? How do I do that? Well, there's a button on there. Over the years, I have found that students need more and more help with figuring out very basic things. I've I've said to students sometimes, I'm not Google. I will get a text. Is the FAFSA open? Why are you messaging me? You could have put the same words into Google. But no, you have to ask me? Right, okay. Or kid comes today. All right, I have to fill this out for my applying for the SAT or whatever. Where do I find this? I said, have you tried clicking through them and trying to sort of figure it out? But what if I do it wrong? I said, just try it. See what happens. You know, I have a promise. If it goes wrong, the phone won't explode. You won't fall through the floor. The ceiling won't fly off. I promise. Just try it. You know, it's really interesting. And I really think that if we can delay technology, they will learn it down the line so quickly. It's so intuitive. I mean, my husband held off on getting he always had, burner phones. Recently, my sons were like, look, Dad, there's this thing called an Apple, and it can do all the things you want. You won't need 6 little devices. It's also got this, hearing thing so that, when you keep saying, what? Shh, don't tell him I said so. So they persuaded him to get it. And I thought, oh dear, I love my husband so much. He's a Renaissance man. He can build anything. But this phone, I was like, I don't know. 2 days later, I said, look. It's like, it's intuitive. They'll get it. They'll get it. I'd prefer for students to learn actual technology, coding, when they're in high school, learning how to code, learn how this really works, the algorithm systems, because that's where they're actually getting the kids. The algorithms and the way they're being driven down stuff, when they realize what that is, that's powerful. That's empowerment. Many kids have the technology. They don't know how to search for something, don't actually know how to do a proper search. They will take the topic and put it into Google and then say, I couldn't find anything. So all the technology resources are kind of useless because they didn't learn how to think, right? And when they have that ability to think, and you see that with kids who didn't have technology and kids who really focused in on reading and laying that foundation, they can go so much further.
Anyway, logic and grammar is probably better preparation anyway.
It is. Absolutely. I have a student who's doing his PhD right now at Stanford in chemistry. So he's taking his sweet time because he's got the grant. It's like, oh, I'm not rushing. I've got 2 years of funding. I'm going to enjoy this. And he had no access to any technology at all. I mean, not even a computer till he was 16. I mean, he learned it in a couple of weeks. He taught himself the coding,
Well, I find it interesting that the children of all those who live in Silicon Valley,
Exactly.
They go to high schools and schools with no technology.
With no technology.
Exactly.
Right.
And then in the summertime, they go to camp.
Yep.
And they do have these, and the first thing they have to do is put it in a locker.
Put it in a locker.
For 2 weeks while they're there, they can't take it out.
Can't take it. Exactly.
So what do they know that we don't know? To your point.
Right.
What do they know that we don't know?
Exactly.
And I think
Exactly.
In terms of reading, like Mr. Mullen and I were looking for a book the other day, and it's out of print.
Yeah.
And I'm looking on Amazon for it, out of print.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but you can get it on a Kindle for $47. I said $47 to have it sent.
Yes. Yes.
So I turned around and I started reading into some things. Children can have a paper book, and they can have the same book on a computer or a technology device. They're finding now that kids cannot, there's gaps. So in other words, as you scroll through
Yep.
the page,
Mm-hmm.
you're losing your train of thought, you're losing your concentration.
Right.
Before the comprehension gets lost.
Yep.
And some other
Yep.
things. Whereas if you have a book with paper,
Mm-hmm.
they're finding that loss doesn't exist at all.
Exactly.
So to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it really
Yep.
is. I'm sending an article out to all the St. Mary's School parents. I just saw
Yeah.
it today. It was in the Catholic Playbook article, and it says
Yeah.
how to build strong readers with 35 easy steps. Yeah, I'm gonna send it.
Yeah.
I already printed it. I had it. So I'm going to be sending it electronically, but a lot of it is kind of what Dr. Kern said at our last
Yeah.
meeting. 15 minutes a day. Said
Yep.
Read to your child if they can't read.
That's right.
If you're going to read to your child, read
Yeah.
above their grade level.
Yep.
By 1 or 2 grades.
Mm-hmm.
Very common.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Absolutely.
I didn't plan this segue, but I'll go into this in what I was actually going to bring up. we're going to be promoting during Lent, instead of giving up, spending time reading, at home as a family, as well as here in school. So stay tuned for more on that. But we need our children to start reading.
Yes.
Reading good material.
Yes. Yes.
And reading for duration, not to quickly get through it. But the flip side where I was going, and Craig had mentioned Silicon Valley, I don't know whether it's still true, but in the 80s and 90s when the great computer craze was starting up and taking over, and of course the Japanese were leading in everything.
Yep.
The fact of the matter was, Japanese students never touched a computer. They never touched technology until they reached a certain age. They learned the writing systems. They learned how to do math. Some schools still on abacus. They learned how to think.
Exactly.
How to think deeply, how to learn deeply. Then when they had that foundation, then they were introduced to technology and they could soar with it.
Now, there must have been something to it, because in the 80s I was working up in Manhattan at the stock exchange. And at that time, the whole world needed to learn to speak Japanese because they were going to take over the world.
I remember that.
Now it's
I remember that.
But you get my point.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
so-
So I'm going to sort of wrap up with two other things. So we've talked about, how did we get here? We've got classical schools that are forming now. There are secular classical schools, which essentially, the Great Heart schools, and I keep hearing that this isn't going to work. Essentially, I know somebody who's teaches at one said, it's funny, like the way we're teaching this, they're all coming out becoming Catholic. Weird that, okay. But in this entire thing, what about minorities? What about African Americans? This is a phenomenal book. So Anika Prather is a friend of mine. I've spoken to her about this several times. She wrote this wonderful book, The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature. Reading freedom. And her argument is that if you want real equality, if you want to end the racism issues, if you want to really move beyond the challenges that we had, what we need is classical education. Black children can read. They can do these things. They can join in. And she started a school in DC for African American children, which is kind of like a hybrid model. So they come to her for 2 days, and then they're at home for a couple of different days. And it really hits home that the truths of Plato are not just for white kids. It's a universal truth. Why would you want to separate this out? Give them that opportunity, and they shine. She has beautiful stories, and I'm friends with her, and so I see these stories about, especially young men that come to her who've come through a school system and they hate school. The concept of school is just anathema. And the next thing they know, they said, actually, Dr. Prather, I love reading this. And they have questions, and they get engaged, and now they want to study, and they want to learn, and they want to go to college. It's brilliant. Yes?
Years ago, I read a book called Marva's Way.
Yep.
The author was Marva Collins.
Yep.
I know you know exactly what I'm speaking of.
Yes.
She was a Chicago public school teacher.
Yep.
Completely surrounded by disaster.
Yep.
Not one kid in her class could read, but they could all fight very well.
Yep.
All African American. She went to fight the Chicago school system and basically told to be quiet.
Yes.
You don't know what you're talking
Yes.
about. She herself is African American.
Right.
She said goodbye to the Chicago school system,
Yep.
rented a room in the heart of the ghetto, the South Side, started a school for the kids basically they wanted to throw out of the school.
Yes.
She didn't use the term,
Yes.
but it was a pure
Classical school.
education
Yep.
these children received. These same kids who could not read their own names
Yep.
in second grade. With her for a while, they were discussing Shakespeare.
Yes.
Plato.
Yes.
The differences between
Yes.
what Plato thought and Aristotle thought. Never mind, then we move into Latin and everything. She could do it.
Yep.
And she did it. This
Yep.
is 30 years ago.
Exactly. And this book just came out a couple of years ago. I'm just going to read a quote from the back. When we place a classic text before Black students and then ask them what they feel about the text, we are communicating that we see them, we value them, and we hold high expectations of them to engage in the great conversation from which their ancestors had been excluded. We become a living example of God's universal love for all of humanity. As classical educators, we invite all students to share in the feast of the canon and thus communicate to them that all of our students are welcome to the promised land. It is profound. I have the highest respect for the work that she does, and because I do teach a lot of African Americans and minorities and kids in different crisis situations, I use this book a lot for resources and concepts and ideas, especially because you can incorporate all kinds of current events. Just because we're reading Plato doesn't mean we can't discuss the halftime show in great detail on Monday after the Super Bowl, which we did, and it was great. It was so great to have that conversation. And ultimately, what I wanted to close with is Charlotte Mason's primary push outside of the, starting with wonder, is narration, the art of narration, storytelling. We need to read stories to our children, and we need to teach them how to tell the stories. We read a story to them, we read Shakespeare to them, you tell it back. We are people of the word, and we've taken that word away. How do we teach children to find those words if we don't give them beautiful things and beautiful art and beautiful music to explore? And so there are great books. The Little Oratory right here is one that I give to all new parents when I get to meet them. We have it in our elementary school. It's by David Clayton, The Beginner's Guide to Praying in the Home. And it's very simple, basic things that you can do as a family at home. Things like having an altar area, having a beautiful icon, having music. What happens when kids are exposed to this is amazing. Just the vocabulary they develop alone.
We had a speaker here 2 weeks ago, speaking on, he was one of our deacons about the domestic church.
Yes. Yep.
And because people don't understand what that is. And same idea.
Yep.
Things in the home.
Yep.
And it's funny, I don't mean to believe it, but it seems that we sell the kids short.
We do.
And it really bothers me.
Yeah.
Because they pick up on it, and they know.
Yeah.
They know. And to your point, coming from the position of such innocence and no biases and no.
Yes.
So they blossom. Like
They
I
do.
watch our little children here.
Yeah.
They get it.
Yeah.
Mr. Palmer, your dad's sick. Yeah, Jimmy. I'm going to pray for him. I said, thank you.
Yes.
So it's there. They
Yeah.
got it. And one of the things that, I don't know, over my 40 years involved with kids and coaching and teaching, I mean, I grew up in a very poor town.
Yep.
And had a lot of issues, 37 bars in 1 square mile. So
Yeah.
you can imagine that there
Yep.
was a lot of fun going on Saturday nights. But it's funny, on Sunday, everybody was at one of the 6 churches.
Yeah.
Whether they had scars, their stitches, or whether they had their Band-Aids, they were there. But the thing that I noticed was, and it's what I see differently now, to that point, we never had anybody want to hurt themselves or hurt each other.
Yeah.
We slept on the beach.
Yep. Yep.
Jimmy didn't want to go home because his dad was drunk again.
Yep.
Or
Yep.
it
Yeah.
was in Quilty's barn
Yep.
in the winter.
Yep.
It was the only shelter we had. Mom, not coming home. We're going to be okay. But none of us or none of them ever nowadays. So what's missing?
Yeah.
What's missing is hope.
The hope.
Missing is that
Yes.
hope, and
Yes.
That God's with Jesus is with me.
Exactly.
It's gone. They've taken
Right.
it away from our kids.
Yeah. Because ultimately, I think we can't talk about education and exclude the domestic church.
I agree.
Because education begins at
We gotta
home.
work together.
Parents are the primary educators, and as primary, that's why I promote, the Little Oratory, the Wounds of Beauty, the Love of Learning, Benedictine Education, the Way of Beauty. This is a beautiful book. I mean, this one's a little harder, so if you're just starting out, you have little kids, this is a great one. But when we have a home where there's order, on a very simple level, parents will come to me, newborn, what should I do? I said, have a regular dinner time. Just, we are people who are designed for liturgy and for tradition. Having dinner and teaching children, it's dinner time regularly instills does so much for their brain development. But the discussions that you can have, I mean, over 30 years of having children sitting at the dinner table, you see that ability to discuss and thought, and not, I'm on my phone, I have to rush off, I have to do something else. But that time together, that holy time, that domestic church is so profoundly beautiful. Reading to the kids, giving them access to books. I work with a lot of families in crisis who say, I can't buy a book. There's libraries. Thank the Lord we're in a country that has libraries. Please ask the libraries to get better books too. I have lists for a lot of things. And I will send libraries, could you get some of these books? I promise you they'll be taken out, and they'll get them sometimes.
That's what I was just talking about, book fairs.
Yes,
You
yes.
gotta be real careful now.
Yep.
Companies, so we got rid of Scholastic books. And we're using
Yep.
Canisius Press now.
Yep, you can't.
The Scholastic books are, well, Craig, you don't have to get rid of it. You can read all, you can look, that's what, 3 million books to see if they're appropriate for our
Right,
children.
yeah, no,
And
no.
again, this is not a judgmental thing, but
Yeah.
the final straw was teach 6th grade Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet.
I don't want to know. Oh no.
Romeo and Juliet were the same sex.
I figured.
Now,
I
said
figured.
for a 6th grader, that's a parent's job.
Yes.
That's,
Yes.
and
Yes.
Shakespeare, leave it alone.
Yeah. Exactly.
But
Exactly.
that's why we finally got rid of the
Yeah.
book fair, because
Yeah.
I'm not going to be. It's got nothing to do with bias. It's just
Right.
got to do with good literature.
Yep.
And
Yep.
why do you have to mess with it?
In the end, sort of to wrap this up, personally, I think that classical education is not only the best way, it's the good, the true, and the beautiful, but it's simple. It is actually incredibly simple. You don't need a curriculum stack this thick. Really, all you need are great books. That's all you need. If you've got an outdoors, send them outdoors. You don't have paint, that's okay. They'll figure it out. Make it a class project to make paint out of berries. You can do it. It is ultimately very simple. And I think that Charlotte Mason had it right, that it begins in the home. It begins with that understanding that the point of education is virtue and coming to know God. It's about stories. It's about telling, knowing how to tell that story, how to have that dialogue. The Catholic intellectual tradition doesn't come out of going through a checklist. It comes from having time and quiet to read. Every year in February, I have what's called Scolae Weeks. I have a program called Sacred Heart, and I take in kids in crisis. So homeless kids, mental health issues, abusive homes, whatever, as well as super bright kids. I have, 9th graders that could be in college, or special needs kids. Every year in February, which are the months where everyone's like, I give them 2 weeks to say, just find a quiet space to read. I don't give them any homework at all. Read, figure out something that you'd love to study, and study it because you want to. And over the years, I've found dozens of students who said, I figured out my career or my vocation because of Scolae. I had the time to just read or go outside in the quiet and think. Sometimes I have to literally give instructions. Go outside. Put on a coat. Some of them don't go out with a coat, all right? Put on a coat, all right? Go to, we'll map it out, go, here's the park, all right? You can sit there, all right? Don't take out your phone. Leave the phone at home, all right? You have to spell it out, and it's very difficult for them at first. As Mrs. Smith, after like 30 seconds, like, I can't do this, I need to. And after a while, they said, you know what? It's so quiet and it's peaceful. And they start craving it. I need quiet. It's beautiful to just look at a tree, even in the wintertime. One kid started sketching because he was just losing it. He called me, he said, Mrs., I can't do this. I said, you have a book, you have a pencil, whatever, draw the tree and send me a picture of it. So he drew it. And he started going back every week. So now I have the picture of the tree without leaves in spring. The typical thing. Sounds sort of, almost kitschy. It actually happened, right? What happened as a result of that is he realized how profoundly he needed that time. He said, I thought I hated art. And now he's constantly drawing something. He said, well, don't show anybody, but, I kind of like doing this. I found I like it. It's peaceful. My mind stops racing. I said, oh, okay. So I'll close with Stratford Caldecott. Stratford Caldecott was a beautiful soul. He died of cancer just a couple years ago. He was good friends with my sister. I have a funny feeling that he's one of those secret saints that we'll find out he's a saint in heaven, you know. But anyway, in his book, Beauty in the World, he says that the human person should be educated for imagination. And he's asked in this interview, how do you do it? He says, imagination comes naturally to children unless it's beaten out of them in some way. And I think public education has kind of beaten that imagination out of our children. So we educate for imagination simply by giving it some encouragement. Classical education is really, fundamentally, it's simple. Give that encouragement. The best stimulus, of course, is for the parents to read stories to the child from an early age, as soon as possible. And then we encourage children to play, to explore, to invent games. We play with them, if we're able. In a more formal setting, use drama, music, dance, poetry, storytelling, mime to teach parts of the curriculum, or integrate those methods into the teaching. Take the children, if you can, to see things and places that will fuel their imagination, even if it's only a field trip in the park, sketching plants, or a visit to the museum, looking for their favorite object and then talking about it to the class. Bring in a guest speaker or two to tell about their experiences. Encourage children to talk to old people, even to interview them to find out what the world used to be like. When teaching history, try to bring it alive. Help them to see that history is all about real people and what they choose to do and what happened to them as a result. Don't be afraid of fairy tales and mythology. G.K. Chesterton, in his book, Orthodoxy, writes about the truth that is in such stories. Ultimately, more than anything, teach children the truth. And that's what classical education is. So thank you very much. Thank you.